Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard two sides, two stories about what happened that night, but only one story can be correct. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, the only thing that could justify Officer Waldman shooting Mr. Ramirez is if Mr. Ramirez was trying to stab Officer Levy with a knife. But there's a problem with that story. Mr. Ramirez did not own this knife. He had not seen this knife. And he certainly had not tried to stab Officer Levy with this knife on that night. Well, how am I so sure of that? Well, the facts don't support it. The facts don't support the proposition that this was Mr. Ramirez's knife. So, how don't they support it? Well, first of all, this knife was said by Officer Levy and Officer Waldman to have been wielded by Mr. Ramirez in his right hand. Now, my client is left-handed, and as you all know, ladies and gentlemen, unless you're ambidextrous, which Mr. Ramirez wasn't, it's very difficult to use a knife or another instrument with your left favoured hand. So why would Mr. Ramirez have tried to stab Officer Waldman with his right hand when he was left-handed? The second thing, ladies and gentlemen, is that this knife had no fingerprints on it. Now, if my client was trying to stab Mr. Ramirez with this knife, there would have been fingerprints left on it, as no doubt there are my fingerprints left on it from holding it. However, this knife, we're told, both Officer Waldman and Officer Levy said they had not touched this knife, and it wasn't touched until the police backup arrived and they had put it in an evidence bag and taken it away for testing, for fingerprint testing. But this knife didn't come back with any fingerprints, and certainly didn't come back with Mr. Ramirez's fingerprints. Also, this knife had no blood on it. Now, if my client, Mr. Ramirez, had stabbed Officer Waldman with this knife, wouldn't there have been blood on it? Ladies and gentlemen, the third thing was, this knife was closed. This knife was closed on the ground when it fell from Mr. Ramirez's hand. The police stated that when the knife dropped from Mr. Ramirez's hand, they didn't touch it, and yet it was found by the backup, when the backup arrived, to be closed. Now, how could the knife, locked back in Mr. Ramirez's hand, have closed by simply falling to the ground? You know, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and you've already been shown, that a locked back knife will not close merely by dropping it to the ground. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there are some apparent weaknesses with my client's case, and I'm going to show them to you and explain them, and we'll see whether they're really weaknesses after all. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, a knife was found at the scene of the crime. However, this knife wasn't Mr. Ramirez's. It could have been dropped by the police or by a passerby, we don't know, but it was certainly not Mr. Ramirez's. The second thing was Officer Levy's cut. Now, from the hospital report, we do know that Officer Levy was cut, but the hospital report doesn't say what instrument caused the cut. We also know from the hospital report that this cut was so small that it didn't even require stitching. It only needed a small butterfly clip. Now, how could Officer Levy have got this cut if it wasn't caused by the knife? Well, there are many ways. I mean, if you remember, my client states that he and Officer Levy were fighting together on the ground. Now, while they were fighting together, there's any number of things: a sharp object on the ground, or a sharp piece of the car, or maybe a ring or something could have caused that cut. Well, maybe not a ring, but something else sharp on either of their persons could have caused that cut with the knife, caused that cut that needed the butterfly clip on it. So, Officer Levy's cut does not show that he was cut with a knife, or that my client was responsible for it. Now, you've also heard from Mr. Ramirez's own lips that he had been drinking that night. But, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, remember that he had only drunk 2 beers and 4 or 5 Scotch and waters, and that was over a period of 5.5 hours. You also remember, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that it hadn't apparently affected his motor skills at all, because you remember that when he and his friends had that race in the park, he was able to win that race and win it quite easily. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is it fair to make Mr. Ramirez pay for the mistake that he made? Now, his mistake was perhaps drinking a little more than he ought to have done. Or his other mistake, he's already stated it, was in stopping and shouting abuse at the ununiformed policeman in an unmarked police car. But, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, was it his fault, and should he be punished for fighting back when that officer hit him? And should he be punished when he got shot merely for fighting back after that officer hit him? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, should my client have to suffer for police brutality? Should he have to bear the marks of this shot and the damage that it caused, him not being able to work as a carpenter anymore and being physically impaired for the rest of his life? Should he have to pay for that, or should the police department have to pay for that? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.